In my last video, the Indian nationalist movement has just started, and it ends with the Lahore Resolution of 1930, in which the Indian National Congress declares Purna Swaraj, or complete independence from the British Empire, as a goal of the nationalist movement. Time to introduce our major players. In one corner, you have the Indian National Congress, which is led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. Both Nehru and Gandhi were Western educated, and they both adhered to the principles of non-violence and civil disobedience. Then you have the All India Muslim League, which is led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And this organisation was basically created because they felt that Congress did not represent the needs of India's Muslims. For the past few decades now, there has been a major rift between India's Hindus and Muslims, and the idea of communalism was taking hold. To put Purna Swaraj into action, Gandhi launched a massive civil disobedience movement in 1930 by launching the Salt March. You may ask, what on earth is a Salt March? Basically, through a series of laws, Indians weren't allowed to produce or sell their own salt, and they were forced to buy expensive, heavily taxed salt from the British monopoly. Gandhi chose to challenge this specific law because it affected all sections of Indian society. He once said, "By taxing salt, the state can reach the starving millions, the sick, and the utterly helpless." Gandhi marched nearly 400 kilometers through his home state of Gujarat, and at Dandi he picked up a handful of salt in defiance of this law. Anyways, this galvanized the entire country around the campaign and brought widespread international attention to the Indian independence movement. Throughout 1930, demonstrations, protests, and civil disobedience took hold across India, and Gandhi became a household name. The government of India met the challenge with repression and jailed over 60,000 satyagrahis, including all the Congress leadership, and declared the organisation illegal. Gandhi and the British Viceroy eventually came to an agreement in 1931 called the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, in which all political prisoners will be released, and in return, Congress will suspend the civil disobedience movement, and will negotiate India's future peacefully in London. In these roundtable conferences, very little much was actually achieved. Britain just would not give in to India's demands for dominion status, and the division between the Congress, Muslim League, the princes, and minority groups meant that no real agreement could be achieved. Eventually, the Government of India Act of 1935 was passed, which introduced elections in India for the first time. But like the Government Act of 1919, the 1935 Act was a massive slap in the face to the nationalists. Nehru actually called it a new charter of slavery. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but the British still had almost all the political and economic power, and it also allowed separate electorates for minority groups, and this was just another way to create more division amongst Indians. Either way, the Congress still swept the floor in the 1937 elections, taking 7 out of the 11 provinces. At this point, the Muslim League started playing off the fear of the Congress Raj, the idea that if Congress dominated India at a federal level, this will lead to more discrimination against Muslims down the line. Alright, so a couple years later, in 1939, Hitler was just being Hitler and starts the Second World War in Europe. Britain declared war on Germany, and without even consulting the elected Indian officials, the Viceroy simply informed the Indian people that they're at war too. Nehru saw this conflict as a war between rival imperial powers, and one that India should never be involved in. Congress wished the Allies well, but they expressed their neutrality and agreed to only join the war if Britain promised independence. Well, that wasn't going to happen, and all the Congress ministers resigned from government. The Muslim League actually supported the war effort, and with Congress out of the picture, the League absolutely took off. The Lahore Resolution of 1940 put forward the two-nation theory of the separate states for India's Muslims. Interesting facts, the word Pakistan was never actually mentioned in this speech. But staying away from high politics, the Second World War dragged on for a while, and Britain was brought to the brink of defeat and avoided a close call in 1940. After Hitler invades the Soviet Union, Japan then attacks Pearl Harbor and began their rapid expansion into Southeast Asia. Japan then wipes out Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia within a matter of months, and then they reached Burma, right on India's doorstep. The Indian army had mobilized its people on a much greater scale than the First World War, with 2.5 million men serving in Burma, North Africa, and Europe. The Burma campaign saw the British, the Indian, American, and Chinese forces all engaged to fight the Japanese. But the Japanese also got help from a certain Subhas Chandra Bose, who was the president of Congress only a few years before. Have you heard of the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend"? Well, that guy took it way too literally, and he collaborated with Nazi Germany and Japan. He created the Azad Hind Provisional Government and the Indian Nationalist Army from Indian prisoners of war, with the aim to liberate India from British rule. The existence of the Azad Hind proved to the British how far some Indians would go to fight for independence, and its legacy even today is divisive. The period between April and August 1942 saw the Japanese move closer and closer to India, and the threat of invasion looms. Britain needed to get the nationalists on their side, so in March 1942, the Cripps mission offered Dominion status after the war ended. But both Gandhi and Jinnah outright rejected this. In August 1942, Congress then passed the famous Quit India Resolution and proposed a complete end to British rule in India. And the classic British response was to put all the Congress leaders in jail. Until the end of the war, there will be very little political activity in India, but we do see the mainstream rise of the Muslim League. In 1943, we have one of the most tragic events in the war with the Bengal famine, in which 3 million people died. Many say that the famine was created by colonial policies, as much needed resources such as grain and rice were diverted to supply British forces in the Middle East and Europe. The war would eventually end with the Japanese surrender in 1945, and the Indian troops finally returned home. So after the war, a couple things have changed. For one, Britain are no longer the lean, mean fighting machine it used to be, and would take years for its economy and military to recover. The USA and the Soviet Union became the two great powers in the world, and they both supported Indian independence. The British Labour government under Clement Attlee came in, and trust me, if you want independence from the British, you do not want Winston Churchill in charge. It was pretty clear that India was going to secure independence, and in February 1947, Attlee declared that Britain would leave India by June 1948. The last British Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, came in and said that he could do one better, and that the British would leave India in 6 months instead. Mountbatten made sure that the cameras and media saw 200 years of British rule ending in warm smiles and handshakes. Now the big question remains about whether India's Muslims had a place in an independent India. Of India's 350 million strong population, around 25% were Muslim and were concentrated mainly in the northwest and east of India. The bottom line of the Muslim League's message was that so long as Muslims remained in the minority in India, Islam was in danger. Gandhi proposed to make Jinnah the Prime Minister of India, but the Muslim League would accept nothing less than Pakistan. Then in Calcutta and Punjab, communal violence between Hindus and Muslims started to erupt. In the end, despite protests from Gandhi, it was decided that the country would be partitioned. So Nehru, Jinnah and Mountbatten now had 6 months to plan Britain's exit and divide the country. Cyril Radcliffe was a man in charge of drawing the border in 6 weeks, and of course this man had never stepped foot in India before. It was decided that the states of Punjab and Bengal, both with large Hindu and Muslim populations, would be split between India and Pakistan. On the 14th of August 1947, Pakistan achieved independence with Muhammad Ali Jinnah as its first head of state. A day later, on the 15th of August, India declared independence from the British, with Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of India. In his speech he stated, "At the stroke of midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awaken to life and freedom." But unfortunately, independence is also shadowed by the scars of partition. With the boundaries announced a few days after independence, people found themselves either in India or Pakistan. Millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of the border and forced to move from their family home, which many had lived in for centuries. Between August and October, one of the largest mass migrations in human history occurred, with around 15 million people making the journey across the border. Both sides committed acts of violence and atrocities, and around 1 million people lost their lives. And India and Pakistan got off to a very bad start. They had an even worse start when a conflict started to emerge in Kashmir. Okay, so remember in the first video when I said that there are roughly 500 princely states spread across British India? Well, at independence, these princely states had the option to join either India or Pakistan. But some were like, screw both of you, I'm going to start my own country. And that's exactly what happened with the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir was a majority Muslim state with a Hindu king and wanted to remain independent. But for Pakistan, this was a Muslim state and therefore belonged in a Muslim country, with the K in Pakistan actually standing for Kashmir. But then for India, as a secular country, it saw no reason why it should just give up Kashmir on the basis of religion. In October 1947, tribal partisans from Pakistan entered the Kashmir Valley to bring the region fully under their control. Fearing an invasion, the Maharaja of Kashmir turned to India for military help, and in exchange, Kashmir agreed to join India afterwards. India then airlifted troops into the state capital, and thus the First Indo-Pakistani War had begun. Fighting continued for over a year, and the UN brokered a ceasefire. India controlled about 2/3 of the state territory, and Kashmir acceded into India. But to this day, Kashmir remains a real roadblock in Indo-Pakistan relations. Then in the massive state of Hyderabad, slightly different story. Again, it was a former princely state, but a Hindu majority population and an insanely wealthy Muslim Nizam, who wanted Hyderabad to remain independent and was building up a personal army to help him out with that. In September 1948, Home Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel launched Operation Polo and used the Indian army to annex Hyderabad and bring the region into the Indian Union, finally ending the princely state problem. But some bad news. In June 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in New Delhi by a Hindu extremist, who believed that Gandhi was being too sympathetic towards the Muslims and Pakistan. Gandhi was a man who helped India to independence, whose face is on every Indian banknote today, and whose principles of non-violence and civil disobedience would carry on long after his death. A few years on, and India officially cut all ties with the British Crown and became the Republic of India in 1950. India's constitution was absolutely massive, but the bottom line was that India was to become the world's largest democracy with civil libertarian values at its core. That's all for this video, and if you gained value from it, I'd be so grateful if you press that subscribe button. In the next and final part, I'm going to cover India under Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and a whole lot more beef with Pakistan. See you then.